Welcome back. Well, in the last few lectures, we've done all kinds of interesting things. We're learning how to build all kinds of interesting programs, but of course you came here to write games. And the kind of games that we'd really like to write are arcade games. Arcade games, two-dimensional arcade games, have a number of interesting features. They always have some sort of a clock where things are happening at a particular frame rate. They also have a specific place on the screen where the action happens. Well, it would be great if those things were built into HTML, but they're not directly. And so if we really want to be able to build a game, wouldn't it be great if HTML had those things built in? It would be. But the next best thing would be to have a library that you could use that would add those things. So whenever you want those features, you can simply use a library. And it turns out we have exactly such a library. In fact, I wrote one for this particular class and this book. So we'll be able to see how it works. You look at the screen in front of you, and it's not terribly exciting, except it has, well, a gray box on the screen and clearly a red ball moving within the box. Now, it's true, we could do this with some plain old HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. In fact, you could do it without JavaScript. But this is a little bit more special because what we're doing is we're beginning to look at a game engine which will allow us to not only do very simple things like this, but much, much more. And if you'd like, we'll go ahead and take a look at the source code, and you can see what's happening here. Well, let me get on the right screen. You look at the source code, and you can see this is surprisingly simple. If you look at the HTML, oh my goodness, it's almost completely empty. The only thing going on here is body on load gets init. Now, it turns out it is possible to get a drawing area in HTML. With HTML5, there's a special element called the canvas tag. You can do very exciting things. If you'd like, you can look at one of my other books to see all kinds of details about how to use the canvas tag. But for this class, the basic idea was, wouldn't it be great if I could make a canvas tag automatically appear when we want and have all the various features that we need to make a game work? When you look at this example, you can see that all the basic ideas we need in gaming are here in this game engine. So let's take a look at how this works. Don't worry if you don't understand all the details yet. We'll spend plenty of time on it. But let's see exactly what's happening. First, we have a body/body, and it starts out empty. Now, onload gets init. What does that do? Well, that just says, hey, whenever the page loads up, we're going to want to run init. And that's pretty typical. We've done that before. All of our games for the rest of the course will have this feature because we'll almost always need an initialization. In fact, we will always need an initialization. It's just true. In gaming, you always have to have an init. Now let's take a look at the header area, and you can see that it begins as very standard HTML5. Nothing shocking here. Now, one thing that's interesting is we do have two script elements. We have an external script, and we have an ordinary internal script. Okay, so the external script is calling SimpleGame.js. Great, what's SimpleGame.js? Well, that is a library that contains a series of really interesting objects for you. And I'll show you a little bit more about what those things are, but that's the library that we have. I'll also show you in just a few minutes how to download that so you can have it yourself, or even how you can use it from my website. So script type is text JavaScript, sources SimpleGame.js. When you bring in that JavaScript file, then you have access to all these other wonderful things we're about to do. If you try to write your games without this file, well, they just won't work. Okay, so that's great. Now we have a second script. This is where we're going to write our custom code. What are we doing? Well, I have a couple of variables, scene and ball. And when you look at the game itself, okay, it's not much of a game. When you look at the animation, I've got this gray box, that's the scene. I've got this red ball, that's the ball. Okay, it makes sense. In gaming, we typically have two kinds of things. First of all, we need to define space and time. And that's what the scene does. The scene says, hey, a particular part of the web page is now going to be my game scene. And so it has a specific height and width. I've got default height and width set here that's relatively good for desktop and iPad apps. We can change it for different devices quite easily. The other thing the scene does is it defines time. Games are always done at a specified frame rate, and that means we're going to redraw the screen many times per second. Web-based games traditionally have run at 12 frames per second. That's the speed of Flash. We're going to go close to double that, 20 frames per second. Sometimes you'll see 30 frames per second. We could certainly get that with this engine, although I've chosen to stick with 20 frames a second because that's good enough for most people, and honestly, it'll work fine on pretty much all devices, even with a large number of objects moving around on the screen. So when we have a scene, what that's doing is it's quietly building a canvas tag, it's attaching it to the page in the right spot, and it's setting up a frame rate. It says, okay, we're going to have some stuff that happens 20 times per second, and that prepares us for doing the game. Now, later on, if you want to, I'll show you exactly how I wrote all that and how we got all that part working. But at this point, that's not that important. What's much more important at the moment is the bigger idea. Hey, I can have this scene object for free, and if I know how to make it, it just happens. Woohoo! That makes us happy. Yes, it does. So the scene is one important object. The other important object is the ball. And the ball is an example of what's called a sprite. In gaming, sprites are the objects that move around on the screen, bonking into each other and giving you points or whatever. Pretty much anything you see moving around on the screen is a sprite in gaming. Sprites have certain characteristics that you'll see as we go, but obviously we should be able to move them, we should be able to do something when they leave the edge of the screen, and we should be able to do something when they crash into each other. So those are the basic things that a sprite does. Make sense? So we've got two main objects here, a scene and a sprite. Take another look at the code and see if you can figure out what I did here. Oh ho ho ho, var scene. So I'm going to make a page level variable called scene, that will represent the scene, and a page level variable called ball, that will represent, you're so far ahead of me, the ball. Great. Now, any games that we write with this game engine will begin by defining at least two variables. We'll almost always define a scene, and we'll define each of our primary sprites. Right now, there's only one. Also, in any one of these games, we'll have two functions at least. We'll have an init function, and we'll have an update function. The init function will be called when the page gets loaded. All right, we understood that. That happens in ordinary JavaScript. But what we do in the init function is pretty interesting. Scene gets new scene. What is that? We're saying, hey, I'm going to make a scene. There's ways that we can do this and specify its size and position and so on, but let's go with the default. Finally we get to make a scene without getting in trouble. So the first thing you have to do is make a scene. The second thing that you'll do is you'll make any sprites you want. Ball gets new sprite. Now when we create a sprite, we do need some parameters. The first one is the name of the scene. A sprite doesn't make sense unless it's attached to a scene. Otherwise it doesn't know, when it's out of bounds. So a sprite will always take a scene or as its first parameter. The second parameter is an image. Right now it's redball.png. I just made a picture of a red ball, threw it in the same directory as the rest of the program, and that's my sprite. I can even refer to images elsewhere on the internet, but generally it's best to have them in your own same directory. The last two parameters are the width and the height of the sprite, so it knows how big to make it. Oh, that's pretty sensitive, isn't it? It's very sensible. So when we create a sprite, we need to know its scene, we need to know a picture associated with it, we need to know a width and a height. Once we have a sprite, it turns out we have some other wonderful things we can do with it. There's many more than I'm showing right now, but here's the basics. We have a set move angle. What do you suppose that does? Well, that sets the angle at which it moves. Okay, yeah, that's pretty good. And ball.setSpeed, what does that do? That sets the ball's speed. Aha. Now this is similar to other kinds of JavaScript you've seen, right? We remember buttons have methods and properties and so on, and so do these custom objects, the scene and the sprite. And remember, a ball is just a kind of a sprite. So this is all making sense, isn't it? Yeah. When we learn what these objects can do, there's a whole lot we can do with them. So in an initialization, the first thing you do is build a scene. The next thing you do is build any sprites you want, maybe give them a few starting characteristics. And then the final thing you do in init is tell the scene, okay, I'm done prepping things, start yourself up. When we tell the scene to start, what that does is that literally starts the game engine, and it causes something to happen 20 times per second. You following? Okay. So what does it cause to happen 20 times per second? Well, the update function. So every time you build a game in this engine, you're going to begin with an init function that talks about what do we happen as soon as we get here. And the second thing you will always have is an update function. And the update function happens once per frame, or 20 times per second. And that's kind of formulaic as well. In every frame, we're going to begin by clearing the scene. Because what happens when we make games is that the page is drawn and redrawn many times per second. So scene.clear clears the scene so that it can be redrawn. Oh, okay. If you don't do that, and I'll show you an example at some point, if you don't do that, then what happens is you get a streak. Because as it draws images, they stay on the screen, and so that's not very pretty. So we like scene.clear, that means clear, erase the screen, and then ball.update says, okay, ball, anything that you were trying to do, go ahead and do it. So if it's supposed to be moving, or if it's supposed to be changing sizes, or checking for bouncing off of things or whatever, do whatever it's supposed to do, and then draw yourself. So for every sprite that we create, we invoke its update method, telling it to draw itself on the screen. Does that make sense? Sure, that makes sense. Okay, so I'm feeling good. Are you feeling good? This is all there is. If you take a look here, that's all that we needed to create this simple little animation. Of course, we can change it, but this is a really good starting place. Okay, come back next time, and I'll show you a few more specifics about how we download the game engine, and we'll take a quick look at the sorts of things we can do in it. All right, I'll see you then.